So this salon is dedicated to a discussion of the war in Ukraine. I want to remind everyone, I actually had to count today, but today is the 99th day of the war, which started on February 24th. Tens of thousands of people have died. Some cities are sort of ceased to exist in Ukraine. I think 20% of Ukrainian territory is under occupation currently. I did not introduce myself. I'm Alya Guseva. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Boston University. I'm also a chief editor, together with Akush Onatash, of the Socio-Economic Review, the SASE journal. I'm also Ukrainian. I was born and grew up in Kharkiv, Ukraine, which has been under constant shelling. My father lives there. He never left the city, so my heart is in Ukraine, and it's sort of been slowly broken in the past 99 days. So this is very much a not only professional, but very much a personal sort of topic for me. But today we're happy and lucky to have three Ukrainian scholars with us to talk about many of the interesting issues. Mariia Shuvalova is a literary critic and lecturer at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, which I think is the oldest university in Ukraine. Yulia Bidenko is associate professor of political science at Karazin, Kharkiv National University, coincidentally my alma mater. And Alexander Rodnyansky is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Cambridge. And I know he's currently on sabbatical, serving as a presidential advisor in the office of the Ukrainian president. And he was telling me that he recently was part of the Ukrainian delegation in Davos to sort of, and maybe he'll reflect on some of those experiences for us as well. So I want to start with an introductory question as a way of the panelists to sort of tell us a little bit about their work. So as a way of telling our audience about the kind of research you do, can you briefly tell us about an aspect or aspects of this war that your specific expertise helps us understand better? And as you speak about this, can you also tell us briefly where you are zooming from and how the war has affected you professionally and personally? I think that would be also very useful. Thank you. Mariia, why don't we start with you, and then Yulia, and then Alexander.
Hi, it's a huge pleasure to be here today, and I'm deeply grateful for the invitation. So I'm a literary scholar, and my field was short stories and contemporary Ukrainian literature. And since 2014, I also started exploring narratives of war, because Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and that caused an outburst of so-called war literature, novels, sketches, short stories, essays, diaries, memories. And 95% of these books were written by soldiers, the veterans, volunteers, and witnesses of the war. And also, as I were into comparative studies, it was interesting for me to look how Russia culture explains the invasion. Maybe there is some sense point meaning for Russia in that. So I started also exploring, is there books which are written by Russian authors about contemporary invasion? And first of all, I'm glad to say that all Ukrainian books that was written about current war since 2014, a lot of them were published, and I prepared a list for you. I will share on our chat the list of these books that were translated, because you may want to look through them. And also I discovered that in Russia, books about contemporary Ukrainian-Russian war started appearing in 2009. So actually before the invasion. And this book described full-scale military invasion of Russian troops in Ukraine that's supposed to happen in 2010, 2011. And as you know, invasion actually happened in 2014. And all these books are affordable, easy accessible. And they consist following narratives that Russian propaganda machine is using now, like Ukraine in a state of civil war, and that USA only make everything worse and use Ukraine, that Russia has to save Russian-speaking people and save the world from World War III, that Ukraine is weak, divided, and actually Ukraine is a fake state. And Ukrainians are creatures that are just worse to be killed because they are Nazis. And when in May 11, General Secretary of Amnesty International told that hatred is a reason for invasion, I clearly understand why she told that, because before actual invasion, there was a lot of work to spread this hatred and first to depict, to image, to justify this invasion, and literature was used for that. And all of that books that were written in Ukraine of Ukrainian authors about invasions, that they taught me a lot what is happening on occupied territories. I would like to highlight the book by Stanislav Aseyev. It's called Isolation, and here he is depicting his experience of being on occupied Donbass, being in concentration camps, because when Russians occupied Donbass, they immediately established concentration camps where they were torturing Ukrainians. And this book was translated into English in 2022, and Ukrainian Harvard Research Institute published it. So exploring contemporary Ukrainian and Russian literature, I learned a lot about propaganda, how early it started appearing and spreading, and how Russian propaganda machine is using cultural institutions, literatures, and festivals, because all that Russian books that were written and published, they got literary awards, they were presented, they was acknowledged. And Ukrainian literature give hint about what life on occupied territories looks like. And it's not a surprise for me what were happening on Bucha, because that was already happening on Donbass. And I am currently in Kyiv. I spent the first few days of the war in Kyiv. Then I evacuated to Khmelnytsky district, which is not so far from the center of the Ukraine. And in a month, I got back to Kyiv again. So the second and third months of the war, I'm still staying in Kyiv. Life is changed with like no weekends, one more job, and a lot of volunteering, because I, as my colleagues who are staying in Ukraine, staying outside Ukraine, we were doing fundraising and buying equipment for military, buying first aid kits and some aid for military. And another important experience which is connected with this war, that Ukrainian academia right now is having unprecedented experience, because educational systems are working in conditions of war, occupation, and displacement. And that changed my aims as a lecturer, because since the second month of the war, we got back to teaching, and our students was all around the world. And also that changed my teaching methods. And I feel that I'm no longer only a researcher, but also I am object of research. It's a very new thing, and I'm trying to keep and to write witnesses reports and work as a journalist as well as a translation. Also, since the second day of the war, I and my literary colleagues, we switched to pro bono translation for office of the president. So it's hard to describe everything what's happening, but that's just main bullet points what we were doing and what we're doing right now. So thank you for your attention. It will be interesting to listen to your questions.
Thank you, Mariia, and thank you for sharing sort of a little bit of your work, and also I'm glad you're back in Kyiv, and thank you for everything that you're doing for Ukraine. And I wanted to remind the participants, you can put your questions in the chat as they occur, and we will sort of handle them at the end of the conversation. We'll have maybe you ask them, or I can read them as well, but keep putting them in the chat if something comes up. Yulia, you're next.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yulia Bidenko from Karazin, Kharkiv National University, and actually now I'm also displaced, but I'm at the moment not ready to go back to Kharkiv because there are more than 2,000 of buildings which are totally destroyed, and just today they attacked a school and it was also destroyed, and we have more than 100 educational institutions building which are devastated by Russian shellings, so it is still dangerous there. But actually, as well as Mariia, I'm teaching a lot for my students because really it's, I would say, a hard task and interesting experience how to organize education for those who displaced, who are maybe staying in Kharkiv and need to go to the shelter every time where it's airstrike alarms, and another people, another students who were displaced for, let's say, Canada, who relocated to different time zones. So the hard task now is how to organize this teaching for those who could be present online, or also for those who just can take tasks and lectures asynchronously. And I would say that as a scholar, now and long before, I'm most interested in the civil society in Ukraine, in Eastern and Central Europe as a key factor for democratization and Euro-integration. And my MA and PhD thesis, they were devoted to ideologies and how they related to political regimes and media and political parties. But next, I was switching for civil society and civic identity. And actually, I'm also was working a lot as a trainer for civic activists, and I'm not just a scholar, but also participating in some initiatives and taking part in NGOs. And of course, as a lot of Ukrainians during first months of the war, I was included in volunteering. Mostly the hard task was how to organize these logistic and supplies from abroad or from the western part of Ukraine to the regions of the east, which were mostly affected. How to overcome this humanitarian crisis, because during the first 2 weeks of a war in Kharkiv, nothing was working. People literally got very close to starvation, and I have experience of my beloved who can't buy any bread or food there. So having a lot of colleagues and friends abroad and all over Ukraine, we try to organize these supplies to the front lines and to the communities which were affected the most. But also I worked with the European Union delegation to Ukraine, and now we relaunch EU Study Days for Ukrainian school children and students who want to get more informed and who want to participate in a European integration for Ukraine. And I really inspired of our youth, and mostly now I find myself in teaching, in consulting, and like I did before, I provide a lot of comments for foreign and national media as well.
Thank you, Yulia. Alexander?
Yes, well, thank you for having me again. I'll just be brief. So in terms of my research, I'm primarily a financial monetary economist, normally working on monetary policy, the interaction of banking and monetary policy, and issues that relate to these topics. And then before the war, I was primarily responsible
Alexander, I think we're losing you for a second.
Team, some of our reforms in that area for coordinating work with the central bank, but also for preparing general structural reforms in Ukraine that concern the labor market and so on and so forth. But ever since the war, I was in Kyiv when it happened, together with the presidential team. The agenda has changed entirely. So now we're really focused on all sorts of topics related to weapons supplies, military matters, sanctions of all sorts, economic, sectoral sanctions, targeted sanctions, individual sanctions, that is, and obviously our reconstruction efforts. And we keep discussing these issues with our international partners in Davos, generally around Europe. I've been on certain trips on behalf of the president to talk with our partners in Germany and the UK. So it's been everything and anything ever since February 24th. So that is how, broadly speaking, my research area and my expertise relates to what I do at the presidential office before the war and how it now relates to the general priorities that we have in the conduct of this current escalation. So I'll be brief when it comes to that. I'll be happy to answer any more questions as they come along. And yes, I'm in Kyiv now again, so that's where I work from.
Thank you, Alexander. I hope to, personally, actually, I would like to understand more about the cost of war and sort of the impact of sanctions or the absence of impact given sort of few, well, we'll talk about this in a little while, but let me start actually with the question that Mariia or the issue that Mariia introduced us to. I actually been sort of thinking a lot, and I'm sure many of you as well. About a month ago, there's a celebration of the World War II Victory Day in Russia, and there's a lot of there's a lot of trepidation, I think, the expectation that something horrible will happen on that day. Putin will announce mobilization or maybe something else of that kind. And nothing really happened on that day. But I think what we have been faced with, a lot of people who sort of read about Ukraine or think about Ukraine daily, is that there is something about this intense glorification of the World War II and the Soviet victory and the sacrifice that has become the core of Russian self-identity. I'm sure you agree with me. I grew up certainly at the shadow of this. I mean, I was born 4 decades after the end of the war, but I certainly grew up with a shadow of this kind of history of that war. So to what extent, Mariia, the question is mainly for you, but others, please feel free as well to chime in. To what extent do you think the apparent broad support for this war inside Russia, and we can sort of argue about this on whether there's actually that sort of broad support or whether people are just afraid. And for example, in opinion polls or even interviews, I watch those very frequently, just interviews with ordinary people in different cities in Russia, where there's, a lot of them seem to be sort of on board with this. So to what extent is this apparent broad support a result of the continuous militarization of the Russian society, largely rooted in the legacy of World War II? Mariia, you spoke about the specific war literature that sort of demonized Ukrainians or sort of framed them in a particular way that made it easier to justify the invasion. But I think it's possible that the seeds of these invasion have been planted a long time ago with this sort of general glorification of war and the legacy of World War II and militarization. I read a very interesting article a few months ago in New York Times about the militarization of children and adolescents in Russia, with all kinds of sort of promotion of this early, adolescent summer camps that are built around military games, military competitions. We have certainly seen some really bizarre kind of imagery of, let's say, baby carriages that were decorated as tanks. Something that is really, really strange to see. So to what extent do you think these seeds were planted a long time ago and kind of almost became inevitable? Because Ukrainian war, of course, is as horrific as it is. It's not the only war Russia has been kind of practicing for the past 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. And to what extent do you think this may color or shape the future relationships between Russia and Ukraine? Because whether we like it or not, whatever Russia looks like after this war is over, and I have no doubt that Ukraine will win, but I don't know when this will happen. At some point, Russia and Ukraine will have to coexist, right? This is the situation where you may hate your neighbor, but the neighbor is not moving anywhere because there's no way to move. So to what extent this kind of history of militarization and glorification of war may also color the future relationships between the two countries? It's a loaded question, but take it as in the direction that you would like, please.
Thank you so much for a great question. And I also agree with you that it's extremely hard to judge how much people are supporting that. And probably we will be able, only after time, we will be able to assess how the support actually was. But what can I say right now? It's that during past decades, mainly Russia were writing the history of Second World War, and it's not only about how they support, but also how academia talk about that. I have a friend, she's also a scholar, she's working in Germany history community, and they're making a research how Second World War was represented in Germany, just handbooks, and how children in school learn it and how students in university learn it. So despite the fact that Ukrainians were and other nations were fighting in the Second World War in Germany, textbooks and copybooks in school and university, there is no mention of Ukraine. And it's explained a lot why Germany also has specific attitude toward Ukraine, but we see a great tendency that there is such research in Germany. And I think that Francis Fukuyama wrote that right now Ukraine has a stage of cultural decolonization. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, a lot of different people from academia, they started percepting history and history presented by Russian scholars with more suspicion. And I think in future, the history of Second World War will be rewritten and rethink. Also, I were taking part in ASN conference in Columbia University, and I saw a lot of scholars from Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. They are also dealing with this unrecognition of all Slavic nations during Second World War. So maybe probably Russians do not want that, and Russian people do not want that, but our position as intellectuals that we think that representatives of Russia culture and Russian elites, they have to rethink their own past. They have to admit that they were providing colonial policies, they were stealing history, and they will have to admit what were they doing and how they were marginalizing not only Ukrainians, but also Belarusians and Latvian people. So this is a vector, and our job as people from academia and literary scholar, historians, is to promote that is the way. If Russia would like to have relationship with Ukraine, that is very natural way to recognize coloniality and to be critical and to rewrite the history. So it's really interesting when it actually will start happening.
It's interesting what you're saying is that Russia has to kind of share in the military, let's say, glory with other nations that have contributed to it. I mean, to this I say that I think in many instances, the label Russian has been taken by many, by Russians themselves, but also by others as an umbrella term that contains all kinds of things, post-Soviet, Slavic, Eastern European. I mean, the interesting sort of anecdote is that there's a lot of people, Russians in particular, that have been offended by a seemingly kind of knee-jerk reaction of Russophobia, resulting in renaming many things Russian. To what I say, well, oftentimes things that are called Russian actually were a kind of a conglomeration of various kinds of things. Like take a Russian food store just down the street from me in Boston. It was called the Russian store, but of course, the kinds of foods that they were selling there were probably from Poland all the way to Mongolia, and everything was called Russian. So they renamed it international, which I think actually is much more accurate. Take the academic programs, Russian studies programs. You know, usually that covers everything, including Slavic, including Ukrainian, Belarusian, and anything in between, right? So somehow that has been kind of a very common way to place a label that assumed, you know, very colonial, of course, label, right? That the Russian Empire and everything that's contained within it will be taken as kind of this signifier, right, of many things that are actually non-Russian.
Yeah, exactly. And even in international Russian studies, it's not used to call Russia an empire and call this culture imperial. Only few English words are dedicated how we can apply colonial methods to USSR. And the history of Second World War is very personal for me because my great-grandfather is buried in Berlin because he was killed the day before the victory on the Second World War. So it's very personal, and each war for my family, it's a tragedy. So I think there was also was a question, will Ukraine glorify our victories? That will definitely happen. And I'm sure that not, because for us, war is a tragedy. It's very, very strange idea for Ukrainians to glorify the war because it's just horrible thing.
That's interesting. Yulia or Alexander, would you like to add to this discussion in any way? And glorification of war in the Soviet sort of memory, or possible future glorification, although Mariia thinks that's not going to happen, of this war in the mindset or national consciousness of Ukrainians.
Well, I want to jump into this discussion with, with a short remark that actually in Soviet Union, this glorification of the victory wasn't, I would say, very promoted since 20 years the war started, because it was kind of a new trend which established in 70s, 60s or 70s. Mm-hmm. And I would say that in Ukraine, I do remember my childhood, and it was also in the 90s. And actually, mostly commemorization about the what happened was to speak to eyewitnesses, to collect their experience and stories, and mostly it wasn't kind of a glorification. And in Ukraine, we were more, I would say, passionate about to understand a lot of things connected to the war, not only the victory, but also we have a lot of people who were forcibly taken to Germany for work, and there are a lot of such people among the grandmothers and grandfathers of my friends. And I would say these post-war studies in Ukraine, they were more about oral histories, they were more about, they were less of state propaganda there. And actually in Russia, if we address to the experience, during the first years of Putin presidency, there also wasn't kind of, this madness about the victory. So they used this narrative and make it very official, maybe during last 15 years, as I can remember. But in Ukraine, vice versa, we have this revising of this narrative, and I would say that we separated in our representation of this experience for our country.
And I have to add, so in my family, there's never been a big sort of glorification of any kind. And my father actually spoke about, his uncle, I think, went all the way to Berlin and came back. And so my father always tell me that whenever people who actually were fighting in the war were asked to talk about it, to kind of say anything sort of like very, to kind of commemorate it in a very kind of public way, most of the people he knew just really shied away from this, because for them, war was suffering, war was, laying in the dirt, bleeding. It was nothing really, it was nothing glorifying about it, certainly not the way that it's been portrayed, as Yulia mentioned, particularly recently by the Russian state, by Russian propaganda. Great. Alexander, anything to add, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll have more to say about the economic topics, but I do have, just a few comments. I think there's a clear parallel between what is happening now and what has developed in Russia over the last decades, and obviously Nazi Germany. And I think the big difference, unfortunately, is that Nazi Germany was defeated, and then you had a huge process of repentance and reconsideration and rethinking of what happened, and on the part of the German people. And I see no sign of that ever happening whatsoever so far in Russia, no matter what the outcome is. So I think in many respects, as perverse as it sounds, the issue that we're facing with Russia is actually much more severe and much more long-term. And there's a risk that it could be much more long-term. So I think, but the ultimate key to finding peace and stability that's permanent in our region lies in that domain, lies in Russia, and lies in finding some solution and finding some way towards reconsideration on the part of the Russian people. So there's the big question of how we can ever reach that point or get there. And unfortunately, I think it won't be without a serious upheaval within Russia at some point. And a serious upheaval in a nuclear nation is always not without risk for the whole of the world. So that's what I will say about concerning these topics. But ultimately, like you said in your question, we will have to live side by side with Russia, and there's no way to transport Russia onto Mars. And in fact, before the war, or long before the war, there was never any intention of doing that, right? We wanted to have good, stable, and friendly relationships with the Russian people. So, but ultimately, the key lies within Russia, and I think it's a big question of how we can ever start that process and get into that path. And unfortunately, we're a long way off from it.
Right. Thank you for that. Okay, next I would like to turn to the impact that the war has on the Russian nation and on the Ukrainian nation and Ukrainian civil society. So if any of you are expert on Ukrainian history, you may correct me, but I think of Ukraine as a young nation and a young democracy. There's certainly, several episodes in the recent history of Ukraine, such as Orange Revolution, Euromaidan, annexation of Crimea, occupation of the parts of the Donbas region, and the presence, until very recently, I have to say, of two Orthodox Ukrainian Orthodox churches, right? The Ukrainian Orthodox Church it looks like parted its way with the Moscow Patriarchate, which was a long overdue. There's been, all of these sort of different events led or betrayed real divisions within Ukrainian society along geographic, religious, linguistic and geopolitical lines. But it seems to me that in the last 99 days, even in those situations where these divisions were particularly acute, for example, the question of the language or the question of religion most recently, that most of these divisions have narrowed or led to strengthening of the solidarity. I mean, are we finally witnessing the birth of Ukraine as a nation, which I'm sure is a process, right? Nations are famously called imagined communities. On this topic, this war is also unusual to the extent to which it's not only fought on the battlefield, but it's also fought in Zoom rooms and on social media. Right? This was probably the most unusual war in that respect, given sort of the, I'd say, the effort and intensity of President Zelensky's team in terms of connecting to various parts of the global society. So there's an enormous amount of cultural production that's happening by the president, the team, celebrities, influencers, and the millions of ordinary people like ourselves as well, volunteers, the military, civilians, academics. So to what extent these events are also shaping and performing Ukraine as a nation and as a civil society? And what do you think the future brings in that respect? Because the war, the 2014 war did not lead necessarily, I think, to healing a lot of these divisions. But maybe this is the time when sort of a lot of them will be finally closed off. Anecdotally, I grew up speaking Russian, and most of my friends in school and in the university the same way, but now pretty much everyone, I'm not sure they're fluently speaking Ukrainian in their day-to-day life, but they're certainly posting in Ukrainian. Everyone with whom I always conversed in Russian, and that's a big sign for a city, that's basically been Russian speaking. I mean, Yulia, I'm sure you can relate to that. So why don't we start with you on this question?
There are a lot of questions, but actually I'm not historian either, but I wouldn't perceive this, so in an easy way. It is very popular narrative at the moment that we are witnessing the birth of modern Ukrainian nation, and Ukraine is a very young nation, and it is young democracy, but still let's do remember the attempts to create independent state in early 20th century, and professors Plochy or Timothy Snyder, they addressed to this topic a lot and brilliantly covered that. And actually in early 90s and late 80s also there were a lot of aspirations about the independence, and let's do remember the results of national referendum held on December 1st, 1991, and there were more than 80% all over Ukraine, not dividing people with the regions, who supported the independence. So I wouldn't say that it is, the brand new processes and we are witnessing something very new. Of course, a lot of these trends, they are more visible at the moment, and moreover, they are more in the focus of the whole world, I would say. But actually, since maybe the Orange Revolution, we can see that Ukrainians, regardless the regional origin, that mostly they consider themselves to be citizens of Ukraine, and this civic identity was growing and growing during past 15 years. It was splash of civic activities and these civic identities after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, and of course conflict in Donbass also made a significant input in these. But I would say that there were trends, and now it is just getting irreversible, as to me. The other point that actually Ukrainian civil society was developed pretty much before the war, and I think that is also kind of a reason why Ukrainian society resistance so efficiently, because a lot of these networks and actually I'm now going to the topic or to the subject of the SASE conference, that we have a lot of these connections with people in different regions, which allow us to react very quickly on challenges appeared with the war. And I just want to remind that according to the Civil Society Institution Sustainability Index, Ukraine has the most developed civil society comparatively to the all other post-Soviet states. And actually it was even better in some years, depending on the year of report, but it was even better functioning that civil society in Hungary, or let's say sometimes in Romania. So I would say this was a key factor that people were united. The other one, I would say, which is more recent, is the decentralization reform, and actually reforms in general. When I'm talking to maybe not representatives of academia, but journalists, or let's say experts in particular spheres, but now they are very interested in Ukraine, I'm just asking people from the stable democracies, how many reform your societies implemented successfully within past 5 years? Because in Ukraine we have kind of a set of reforms, and a lot of them were successful. But those who were, as you mentioned, in, let's say, Russian studies, Eurasian studies, they do not pay attention to these significantly. It's not about that nothing happened in Ukraine and Ukraine wasn't move successfully through this democratic transition. Now, it was because it was undercovered and underestimated and underappreciated, I would say. But decentralization reform was actually appreciated among Ukrainians, and more than 56% said that it is really kind of example of very successful reform. And during this decentralization, the level of local activism and people involving in policy making significantly increased. And actually, it's also reshaped local elites in Ukraine, because a lot of civil activists, they became kind of local deputies, and they was involved in this policy making on the ground. And from another point of view, these local elites, they were much more loyal to Ukraine if we compare the conflict in Donbass and the full-scale invasion. So that is why Russians kidnapped more than 20 mayors in Ukrainian east and south, but they mostly stay loyal to Ukraine. And moreover, people protesting against occupation. And I would say it's also kind of pattern from Ukrainian political culture, which is not very new, because in Ukraine, people never was afraid to protest and to express their opinion fluently. And maybe the last factor which I would put here as the key factor of Ukrainian resistance is digitalization. Because let's agree, and maybe it's kind of an answer on your question about the cultural production, communication, and so on and so forth. Actually, we're facing with a war in the center of Europe, but it's kind of a first large-scale war when social media and digital tools are so developed. And digitalization, I'm sorry, I'm after my lectures, is very successful in Ukraine, and it is part of the secret why public institutions are working so hard, and why actually Ukrainians trust them, because the main trend before the war was that Ukrainians trust to each other, trust to volunteers, trust to civil society organization, but they were unconfident in every public institutions. Now people see that they can get any service from the state using just mobile phone, and they can see that public servants who they apply or request something on the ground being displaced, they're really open to communication and try to be helpful. And actually this digital community of Ukrainians who are not only in Ukraine but all over the world, they make this input in this support for Ukraine. In maybe the better story that our education also was reformed, and I can see a lot of young people who are fluently speaking English, who can express their position using Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so on and so forth. So they can enjoy both media literacy, digital skills, and lingual skills. And it is very important because Ukraine really portrays it as a young nation, and actually we can see that even political elites in Ukraine, they are pretty young comparatively to authoritarian rulers of our neighbors.
Last point, Yulia, thank you. On this last point, there is a wonderful I don't know whether that's an article or like a series of pictures that just circulated the internet about how this is the war of two different generations, right? The Putin's generation of people born in the 40s and 50s, and Zelensky generation of people born in the 70s. And it's sort of, I think the analysis basically talks about how Putin's Russia squashed a lot of the kind of next generation potentially coming to power, like Navalny, for example, by poisoning, exiling, or imprisoning, many of them, trying to hold on to power, and how Ukraine, perceived in a much different light in that respect.
I just add briefly.
Sure.
Of course, if you use elite approach to analyze the war, you can portray this war as the war of generation. But actually, in Ukrainian army, among Ukrainian volunteers, there are a lot of people of different generations. Maybe even opposite Russian army, our army is an army of different generations, and all of them are respected. Moreover, people who are speaking Russian, Ukrainian, or even Hungarian, they defending the country all together, as well as volunteers. There are a lot of old ladies who are producing equipment or cooking, for example, for their neighbors or for Ukrainian army forces or territorial defense troops. So it is not about the generations, I would say. It is war of political, or it is war of identities and maybe a political culture pattern. Because just yesterday, they published results of sociological survey, and there are more 70% of Ukrainians who consider democracy to be the best model for Ukraine. So if you check Russian survey, is not only taken during the war, but still they very critical towards democracy. And let's remember that they also use this term "dermokratia" just to, like a shitocracy. I'm sorry for my language, but still, it is true. So in Russia, they try to portray democracy, Europe, West, as a collective actor, as a very immoral or very, I would say, dangerous thing. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, people are very pro-European, and even more, since that war, 25% of Ukrainians, they feel themselves to be European. This is kind of a new trend.
Thank you, Yulia. Mariia, I'm sorry, I want to jump to cost of war, but actually this event was scheduled for an hour, but I'm told that we can go for longer. I know that panelists, you may have other things to do, so I want to make sure we talked about the cost, and then we'll return back to some of these questions. And meanwhile, actually, Mariia and Yulia, while Alexander talks, would you look through the chat to see what the questions were put in, because some of them will be more pertinent to some of your expertise.
I'm already there.
Thank you, I appreciate this. So let's talk about the sort of elephant in the room, about the cost of this war, right? There's been a lot of questions about how, when this war will end. And I think a lot of the analysts are saying, well, for as long as Russia, for example, has money to finance this war, and it's costing Russia something, I have this number somewhere, I think it's $900 million a day on this war. However, Russia's oil and gas revenue this year will be about 285 billion, according to Bloomberg estimates. Just recently, 2 days ago, I think Europe finally went in with the decision to put embargo on oil imports from Russia. But basically, Alexander, I hope you can comment on these things, both the extent to which the sanctions that everybody was hoping will kind of strangle the Russian economy, but it hasn't so far. And as long as oil and gas, and actually many other things as well. Russia is able to export, sell abroad, and receive those revenues. It may be able to finance this war for quite longer than most of us would like. And on the other hand, I've also read that if the war continues for another few months, something like 90% of people in Ukraine will fall below poverty level, because Ukrainian economy obviously is suffering enormously despite the constant help from abroad. So maybe you can, Alexander, can tell us a little bit about what's happening with the cost and projections of cost of this war.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And in terms of the time management, I have exactly 5 minutes, because at the hour we actually have a meeting of our sanctions group on exactly these issues. So I'll have to leave you there in terms of the time management. I wasn't expecting that, we would only have this amount. But anyway, so yes, obviously that's key priority. Sanctions have been insufficient because the whole purpose of those economic sanctions was to stop the war effort, but to make sure that Russia doesn't have enough financing to continue the war effort. And that was a realistic prospect if oil and gas had been fully sanctioned through an embargo. Because remember, Russia's state budget is more or less 1/3 dependent only on the oil sales. And if you add gas, that's more than 50% of direct and indirect revenues from the gas sales and the oil sales together. So that's more than 50% of Russia's budget. And if you took that money away, then obviously you wouldn't have enough resources left to continue the war effort as currently. So that's the big elephant in the room. That's the main objective, but we haven't been able to achieve it, primarily because Europe has made itself so reliant on the imports of Russia's gas in particular, but also oil, that it's still, may be feasible in the medium run. So that is in the next 1 or 2 years, but still with a big question mark. So that's where we at. There's other steps that you could take as a sort of compromise solution that Europe hasn't been able to do either. So you could think about escrow accounts. That is when Russia is still able to sell the oil and the gas, but it wouldn't receive the funds necessarily immediately, and only over some time period and only for specific purposes. So that has, for example, been implemented in previous sanction rounds with other countries. It hasn't been implemented with Russia, and there's no willingness of European countries to do that. Then there's the option of taxing oil and gas imports through essentially a tariff. Again, that hasn't been done. So there's intermediate things that could have been considered or as a compromise solution, if you want. But all of that is very hard for political reasons. But yeah, so that's what we're basically working on as far as sectoral sanctions are concerned. There's another very important component that pertains to personal sanctions or individual targeted sanctions. That is actually quite important, maybe not less important in the medium run, because you're dealing with a huge fraction of Russia's criminal and corrupt elites that have made their wealth through nepotism and corruption. And you want to make sure that you, first of all, seize that wealth and make sure that we have access to it for our reconstruction purposes. So as compensation, that is only fair and efficient. If you look at Switzerland, for example, then by the estimates that you get there from the banking associations, the Swiss Banking Association, you see that it's about $200 billion that have been invested on the part of the Russian elites in Switzerland. Just $200 billion of wealth, and that's probably a lower bound. So it's likely more than that. So that's almost half of what we need for our reconstruction. You asked about the numbers. So current estimates have it that the direct and indirect costs that have already been accrued as a result of this conflict are somewhere about $600 billion and above, so up to $1 trillion. That's the direct and indirect costs. In other words, if you look just at the direct infrastructural damage, you're somewhere around $110 billion maybe. So that's less, but still, a huge number. And almost, it's reaching close to what we used to have as the GDP, as our GDP, yearly GDP in 2020, for example, or 2019. So it's immense. But if you look at the indirect costs, then you realize that as a result of this destruction, a lot of things aren't going to be produced. A lot of jobs are going to get lost. A lot of things and activity that would have happened over the years isn't happening. So if you count all of that in, then you reach those enormous numbers that are many times more than our GDP, somewhere around 600 billion, maybe up to $1 trillion. So that is something that, will take years to rebuild and reconstruct, and that's why we need this Marshall Plan, and that's why we're working on implementing a new reconstruction fund for Ukraine, and that's why we need those assets, and not just for the purposes of Ukraine, by the way, but also for the long-term purposes of Russia. So coming back to this issue that we had before of living side by side with Russia in the future, we want to make sure that it's a democratic country, and we want to make sure that there's a very clear signal sent to the Russian population that corruption does not pay off. And in that sense, you do want to penalize, punish, and seize the assets of those corrupt elites, because there's just no other way to do it, essentially, even for the benefit of Russia. Now, as far as those estimates are concerned, just to wrap up about what the poverty line might be and how many people end up in poverty. So I'm not a big fan of precise estimates at this point, because you can imagine just the margin of error that's in there, given what's happening. It's very hard to calculate. But we know, for example, that the World Bank and the IMF are expecting around a 50% contraction, 45 to 50% contraction of our GDP. So that tells you about, what the living standards will be. And whether it's 90 or 70 or 80% below the poverty gap, I think is almost a secondary issue at this point. The fact is we were almost the poorest country, along with Moldova, in Europe before the war started, per capita, so that is per head. So now we're going to be definitely the poorest, and by a wide margin. So that's what we're starting from, and that's what we're dealing with. And it's a generational concern and challenge that we will have to deal with. But numbers are staggering, and the demand for reforms, so for the reconstruction effort, will be a generational challenge going forward.
Thank you, Alexander. And I'm sorry we had a short time. I didn't realize that you have to leave, but this gave us a very kind of clear and I think very well articulated sort of situation that Ukraine found itself in, both in terms of how to stop this war by inflicting most sort of economic damage on Russia, so it will stop financing it, and how also to find resources to rebuild and reconstruct Ukraine when it's all over. These are obviously probably the two most difficult questions, but I'm sure that the best minds are working on them as we speak. So thank you for joining us. I know you have to go, but the rest of you can stay. We can still try to wrap things up.
Yeah, thank you. I was planning for an hour, so if I knew it was longer, perhaps we could have dealt with that earlier. But thank you for having me, and it's great to be on.
I hope this is not the last time then.
Yes, absolutely. It'd be a pleasure to reconvene at some point in the future. Thank you.
Alexander. Okay, and good luck.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right. So I wanted to go back. Mariia, you had a comment, I think. We were discussing something before. Maybe we can jump back on that. And meanwhile, and then I'll ask you to reflect on some of the questions that we have left in the chat. And please, if those of you who are still in the audience want to ask more, there's probably a few minutes to do that.
Yeah,
Mariia,
I would like to thank you so much. I would like to make 2 comments about history, about digitalization. I would like to think that maybe it's in Western, more broad context, Ukraine as independent democratic culture appeared recently. Because if we're talking about Ukrainian scholars and Ukrainians, we know that Ukrainian language was formed in 11th century, and we have a lot of architectural and archaeological proofs of that. And Ukrainian culture is ancient, so from 11th century, folk songs and a lot of broad folk culture in Ukrainian. And also we have like ancient history of Ukraine, Middle Age history of Ukraine, modern and contemporary history of Ukraine. And we always have a culture, always have language, but it's true that Ukraine not always have an independence, but it always has movements, national movements that were fighting for independence. And West may see this war like a modern contemporary war, but actually we are struggling from Russian imperial policies for last 400 years. And I will send in chat an article. It's an example for executed Renaissance, how Soviet authorities were killing Ukrainian intellectuals just because they were talking Ukrainians. And for Ukrainians, Ukraine has huge history of resistance. I would like to say that we are not brave. We just experienced, because we have already seen these autocracies, these wars, these crimes. So we have huge history of Ukraine. It's actual history of resistance. And I really like that right now there is movement of reducing West planning of Ukraine. It's when West academia explaining Ukraine without local knowledge. And I would like to recommend Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, because it's very well combination of local knowledge and global context. And also I would like to say that I'm really grateful that you invited Ukrainians to talk about Ukraine. And last comment about digitalization. Thank you, Julia, for mentioning that. And it's always a huge pleasure to listen to your talks. I'm a huge fan of you. And digitalization was crucial because on the second week of the war, I was under having shellings and I were hiding in a basement, but on my basement was an internet. And I was able to just in 5 minutes open virtual credit card and get donation in euros and dollars on my credit card. And we had a lot of banks regulations, so it was very hard to make payments, but there is Ukrainian cryptocurrency stock market. And in my basement, I will able to buy cryptocurrency and pay in this cryptocurrency for bulletproof vest that was delivered from China to Kharkiv. And it was outstanding. And I would like to thank, because some people who are listening to this lecture, they actually donated for this vest. So it was very unusual for generations that are native users of technologies taking part in this war, because cryptocurrency, social media, it was also a tool for us, and digitalization make it possible, and especially that Ukraine has official regulated cryptocurrency market. And I have never worked with that before, but because I'm just a literary scholar. But when there is a need, it's user-friendly, and that's how I discovered official cryptocurrency market in Ukraine.
Great, thank you. So Yulia or Mariia, you had a chance to look at the chat. Do you want to pick up a question or two to respond to?
Well, I want to refer the question about the future, let's say, here of Ukrainian political landscape after the victory. And I appreciate the question how to avoid these abuses of nationalism. Actually, I do not believe that there will be kind of far-right nationalism in Ukraine, which will get some political representation. I can explain it with, for example, election results during 2014, 2019. So these kind of political parties, they get about 1 or 2% in general, taken in general. And also at the moment, cohesion of Ukrainian society felt by people as a very significant, as very high. And it is interesting that people from the eastern part of Ukraine, who mostly Russian speaking, who are opposing this nationalistic trend, they feel this cohesion even higher than those who are in the west or in the center of the country. And another very important fact that I have a strong feeling that Ukraine now, even now, more moving to the liberal spectrum, to the liberalization. I said before that actually comparatively to other post-Soviet states, excluding the Baltic states, of course, but Ukraine was kind of a wild, wild west, because there are very slight rules, there are very liberal legislation for public actions, for registering NGOs, for creating media. There were very few regulations on that. And even the fact that Ukrainians voted, I do not believe that it is really current, public opinion, but still in our DIA state services which are available through cell phone, people can also vote for kind of proposition, and 60% of Ukrainians who used this DIA and took part in this survey, they even voted for liberalization of guns among civic population. So it's very liberal, and I would say that Ukraine is moving, I would say, to more liberal agenda than even libertarian ones, than to nationalist ones.
Great. Mariia, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to highlight that there is such term as a defensive nationalism. Each time certain nation is under the threat, it's always rise of national movement just in order to protect your sovereignty. So it's very natural movement, and it doesn't mean that when defensive nationalism developing in country which is in the state of war, it doesn't mean that it will lead to different unpleasant and problematic movements. So every time Ukraine had a threat of national sovereignty, level of nationalism was higher, but also Ukrainian has an experience of having its own state. And when Ukraine were having that, we were definitely inclined to build democratic and liberal society.
Mm-hmm. I have to sort of add to this that my scant reading of Ukrainian history, and that probably is because I'm a product of this Russian colonization, having grew up under Soviet Union, basically in the east of Ukraine, but nevertheless, sort of more recent reading of history is such that Ukraine has always been trying to fight and assert its sort of nationhood, its national consciousness. I mean, I recently took a very interesting, did a really interesting exercise of comparing the lyrics of Ukrainian anthem and the lyrics of the Russian anthem, and they could not be more far apart, right? The Russian anthem, which actually used the same music that everyone who grew up under the Soviet rule knows by heart, I'm sure still, the same music, and changed the words. But the words are not really, they're changed, but they're not really changed in spirit very much. Like the first line, for example, of the Russian anthem says, Russia is our great state and our sacred sacred motherland. So this greatness is really at the core what ordinary Russians think of themselves. Like the first line of Ukrainian anthem is actually much more modest, right? Ukraine hasn't died yet, or its glory and freedom have not died yet. Right, because it's always found itself for centuries in this constant state of battle and fighting. But I wanted to also ask you, there's a question from Mark Cassell. I'm not sure he's still in the audience, but he asked, assuming the conflict only ends in both sides, when both sides feel like they've succeeded, what is the likely end game? What would be a compromise that Russia and Ukraine would accept? On this note, there's a lot of Russian media has talked recently about this one remark by Henry Kissinger, who I think is 97 years old, right? Who at Davos, I think, famously said something about his concern about ending the war in a way that helps Russia save its face. And you can imagine what kind of reaction that comment and that sort of playing of that comment on the Russian media then took among the Ukrainian media personalities or influencers or journalists, because really, right, is that, but nevertheless, saving Russia's face has also been kind of recurrent theme with some of the European leaders. I mean, Macron, for example, famously would, make, to me, inexplicably frequent trips or making calls to the Russian president. I don't know what they managed to talk about so frequently or for such a long time, but it seems like he also was publicly advocating for measures that would help Russia save its face. And that, of course, is a compromise, or that's a demand that Ukraine cannot, accept, because that would essentially mean conceding the loss of the territories. And right now, about 20%, I think I've mentioned this earlier, of Russian territory is under occupation. So I wonder what you have to say on this question of the end game. What would be acceptable to both sides? Because my understanding is that the negotiations that have been kind of going somehow in the beginning of this war completely stalled at this point.
Well, it's very uneasy question how to end the war, and I just want to say that I just can say that those who are proponents of this realpolitik approach in international relations, they are not talking about how many people could be tortured, killed, raped, being under Russian occupation. So it is not about territories, it's about Ukrainian people who are now suffering in many very cruel ways. So for Ukraine, I think it is unacceptable to just to give up these territories at that point. I mean, of course, those territories which were occupied recently during the full-scale invasion. Now, the brave part of Ukrainian politicians and bloggers, they say that actually maybe we get a wonderful chance to get back territories of Crimea and Donbass back. I'm a little bit less optimistic in that, but it is very dependent. Situation is changing. Over the week, we can see that Ukraine comes to counterattacks and counteroffense. Other weeks we can see that Russia occupies more territories. So it is uncertain for me now, but of course I can totally predict that Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people in general as whole, they will fight to liberate territories with Ukrainian citizens because it's the matter of their lives. It's not about how you draw in the map. Maybe in the minds of these old professors it is so, but what we all faced not only in Bucha, let's talk about Kharkiv region, Malaragan, Izium, about Lugansk and Donbass regions, about Mariupol. So it is obviously that we can allow Russia to kidnap our citizens, to take them as hostages of Russian Federation. So my appeal to the world and to everybody who can hear me, that please work with your governments, work with your colleagues to provide Ukraine this support. And I don't believe in appeasement because it was the wrong strategy since 2014, when we tried to appease Russia and the sanctions were very smooth, I would say, we get the full-scale war in Ukraine.
And I think that appeasement started earlier. There's Georgia, there's Prидnestrovia. I mean, there's a whole series of, there's Chechnya, although that was kind of internal Russia's, two bloody wars, but nevertheless, there's a lot of this kind of series of the West looking the other way, actually, until pretty much now. But thank you, Yulia. And I want to add to your plea to, everyone who's still with us to, I think the biggest fear of mine is that we will become, or people will become, the world become complacent and forget about the fact that the war is going on, because I think it's human nature to turn your gaze to something else that just came up. That's something, there's lots of horrible things have happened in the US with, shootings and children dying and Supreme Court making decisions that are unfathomable since this war started. And it's very easy to lose the attention and to kind of forget about it. So please don't. Please sort of keep talking about this war, because it needs to end. I don't know how, but clearly it needs to end. Mariia.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to add that there is a generation of Ukrainian writers, so generations that were writing in 80s, and they were considering how to stop being Soviet people. And their answer was to take a responsibility. Because one main feature of Soviet ideologies was avoiding responsibility. And I think it's great advice to Russia how to save Putin's face, that Putin can save his own face, and Russia can build its own bright future. I were living for 10 years with a huge poster outside of my window, and there were written that only Ukraine can save Ukraine. And it's a great idea to suggest that Russia can save itself. Putin can save itself its own face. It's not Ukrainian job to save them, because we're saving ourselves. So it's nice to remember that they have to take their responsibility for their reputation.
Thank you. That is very true. There's a Soviet movie that I'm sure you have seen called "To Kill the Dragon," and there's this very famous phrase that I keep kind of repeating to myself and sometimes in conversations. The dragon was this monstrous creature that was haunting the nearby town. It's actually based on a book by, I think, an author that was repressed during Stalin regime in the 1930s. His name was Schwartz, but the idea was that the citizens of the town were so afraid of the dragon. But the main kind of lesson from this movie was that everyone has to start by killing the dragon within their own self. That is the fear itself, and it's the complacency, and it's this sense of I cannot influence anything. That was the way in which the dragon was winning over the town. And I always reminded of this when I watch some of these interviews that I've mentioned. Sometimes I watch of ordinary Russians being asked by various media outlets about what they think about the war, what they think about what's happening. And a very common refrain, and it's really shocking, but this is exactly the Soviet mentality: we cannot do anything. There is nothing that we do will have any influence. We're little people, and they must know what they're doing, meaning the elites in the Kremlin, and kind of justifying this war because they must have had a reason if they had to do this. It's not our decision. We have no influence over anything. And this is exactly, I think, all of us who grew up in during Soviet regime. I mean, I think most of you are younger than me, but I've had my share of that sort of Soviet kind of influence. We had to, although I lived in the US for a long time, but we have to be constantly kind of reminding ourselves that this passivity, this sort of feeling that you cannot influence anything, is the remnant of the past, and you have to get rid of it as much as you can, starting from your own self. So, all right. I think we are almost to the point where we probably need to go, as much as I would love to keep everyone and keep talking about those things. It was wonderful, Mariia and Yulia, to have you over. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we gave a taste also of the kinds of things that Ukrainian academics are doing, and they're wonderful things. And some of you also doing not only, teaching and sort of academic research, but also participating actively in various kind of practical things to help Ukraine get through this very tough period in its history. I wanted to give words to Jackie O'Reilly. Jackie is the president of Society for Advancement of Socio-Economics, and she just want to say a few words at the end to wrap things up and to talk about the conference that some of us are going to attend in Amsterdam just a month from now. Jackie, please.
Very briefly, because it's late. First of all, I just want to thank Alya and Akos for actually coming up with this proposal and for inviting Yulia and Mariia and Alexandra. Really appreciate your contributions. And the only small reflection I wanted to make was based on some previous salons we had earlier in this series on fractious feminism and feminist solidarities. And I think what one of the themes of the conference is to look at connections, which are complicated, and looking at fractious ones, it makes it more visible how people are connected and what they fight over. And unfortunately, we see that very clearly in the Ukraine case. I think listening to you, there's two things I found really helpful to think about is like new forms of solidarity and new connections. And secondly, what you've said about digital. And that's just so interesting how new types of connections or wars are being fought on new frontiers in terms of what issues around activism and resistance are taking form. So I found it extraordinarily helpful just to listen to you, to think about how that will feed into the concept I want to develop at the conference about what people fight over, how people find they have new solidarities with people they didn't know any before, and how we find different channels about that. So I just wanted to really thank you for that input. It's really valuable. For the rest of you, if you want to join us for the SASE conference online, if you're not coming to Amsterdam, you'll be able to do that through live streaming, and that will be available on the website. So thank you very much, all of you. That's all I've got to say. Have a lovely evening. It's the Queen's birthday here, so we're all going to have a street party. Sorry about that. Another Commonwealth post-imperial experience from the UK. So thank you very much, everybody. And that's all from me.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Jacob, for organizing all this. So, and thank you, SASE. So until onwards to a new salon, and hopefully seeing a few familiar faces in Amsterdam in about a month.